Bien, mes amis, traduttore, traditore. Alors, nous avons le plaisir.
So we are pleased to hear from our first speaker, Guillermo de los Reyes, who is a professor at Houston and who is part of the associations who organize this beautiful initiative. I suggest that we proceed in the following way. We have 3 presentations and we shall go through all 3 presentations. We'll limit the question and answer time because if you take a look at the program, you will see that around 3:15 p.m. we will have finished, and this will enable us to first and foremost take a break and then to head to Groussier Temple for the remainder of the program of this conference. Are there any questions before we get going? And as Mr. Rich was said, are you comfortable?
Pepsi Cola. It's okay for you? Merci, Guillermo.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you very much, Mr. Coutel. Call me Charles.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I cannot speak French. I'll speak in English. Buenas tardes. And the title of my presentation, Gender, Nationalism, and Fraternity, Considerations of the Gender and National Controversies in Fraternal Orders, is a response to my work that I have done on gender and Freemasonry. But also I'm interested in how now this beginning proposal that I'm presenting today about other fraternal orders and how nationalism and nationalistic discourses do not promote or promote gender inclusivity through times. Fraternal orders have played a pivotal role in shaping societies and political landscapes across the world. Often shrouded in tradition and secrecy, these organizations have historically been exclusive and male-dominated. The theme of gender, nationalism, and fraternity intersects within these orders, leading to significant controversies, but also transformations. This presentation will explore briefly the some historical and contemporary issues related to gender and nationalism in fraternal orders, examining how these elements interact and shape the identities and functions of these organizations. My goal today is not to talk about who was the first woman Freemason, or which Masonic body has the first one, although I will mention some historical facts, but it's rather to have a reflection on why there is this impact on gender inclusion. I will explore scholarship on nationalism and gender and analyze the processes by which gender affects and is impacted by the development of nationalism in the context of fraternal orders such as Freemasonry, Easter Star, and some others. Sometimes referred to as gendered nationalism, gender and nationalism describes the phenomena whereby conceptions of this state or nation, including notions of citizenship, sovereignty, or national identity, contribute to or arise in relation to gender roles. Because of their history, fraternal orders, such as the Freemasons, are prominent in several areas of the world. Over time, fraternal orders expanded their influence, playing crucial roles in political movements and cultural changes. For example, Freemasonry spread across Europe and the Americas, influencing cultural and political changes and also the formation of nation-states and democratic ideals. Traditionally, fraternal orders excluded women, reinforcing patriarchal structures within these organizations. This exclusion limited women's participation and shaped this order's internal culture and external perceptions. Efforts to include women have faced resistance, leading to significant controversies. For instance, including women in Masonic lodges has been a contentious issue, with some lodges accepting female members while others remain strictly male only. Just to give you an example, one time I was doing field work and I interviewed several Freemasons in the city of Washington, D.C. And one of them told me that this was back in 2010, including women in Freemasonry will be, and I quote, the destruction of Freemasonry, end of quote. These debates highlight the ongoing struggle for gender equality within fraternal orders. As Felipe Corte Real de Camargo and yours truly have argued before in a special issue on gender and Freemasonry for REMLAC, a section of the Anderson Constitutions called charges of a Freemason complied the basic regulations of the craft. The 6 core points were, and I quote, to be read at the making of new brethren, or when the master shall order it, end of quote. Among those regulations express instructions on who should be admitted into the newborn society. And I quote again, the persons admitted, members of lodge, must be good and true men, freeborn and of mature and discreet age, no bondmen, no women, no immoral or scandalous men, but of good report, end of quote. This is from the Anderson Constitutions. For 18th century English society, there was nothing scandalous about these bylaws. An active role in society was something reserved for a few individuals. Besides its slightly latitudinarian aspect, the constitutions did not cross the channel successfully. The legacy of this book and its potential as the ground rules of Freemasonry started to be explored in continental Europe only in the following century. The inefficiency in European soil of the rules that conducted English Freemasonry reveals a different practice. In Netherlands and France, some lodges had women among their members, and by the mid-18th century, a variant of the Masonic ritual was put in place for women's lodges, the adoption rite. In Masonic orthodoxy, the adoption lodges are regarded as an appendant body, but not Freemasonry. Thus, the experience of the adoption rite is overrun as genuinely Masonic. However, if analyzed by edict definitions, using an anthropologic term, the craft can be understood as a social practice within which the adoption rite was one of its many liturgies. Although the Freemasonry practice in the islands of Great Britain and Ireland kept its character of men's club sociability, its European counterparts adopted a more esoteric and liberal approach. For instance, in the 19th century, several grand lodges suppressed the necessity of believing in a supreme being. Women were initiated in some male lodges that understood that discrimination was against the Masonic ideals. Some other short-lived Masonic rites accepted women as full members. That is the case of the Egyptian rite founded by the infamous Count of Cagliostro in Bordeaux during the 1780s, and its derivative rite of Memphis Mizraim, which ended by surpassing its original in members and popularity. At the same time, in the United States, appendant orders were created to accommodate Masons' relatives, wives, sisters, daughters, etc. These orders mixed Freemasonry with evangelicalism, preponderant in the then young nation, Order of the Eastern Star, Order of the Amaranth, Ladies Oriental Shrine of North America, the Order of the White Shrine of Jerusalem. All of these orders had and have their own rites and rituals, besides providing a hub for the Freemasons' families to socialize together. This separation between the originally exclusive male Freemasonry and the tutored mixed co-masonry would gain another layer of separation: Prince Hall Freemasonry. The Freemasonry exclusive to African Americans also has its ladies' orders, the Heroines of Jericho and the Order of the Syrenes. During the 18th century, the Masonic lodges presented a distinctively revolutionary trait that manifested itself in the practice of religious tolerance, acceptance of women within Freemasonry, and the promotion of the liberal idiosyncrasy, as documented by several historians, such as Margaret Jacob, who was here this morning. The revolutionary and liberal attitudes of Masonic lodges clash head-on with the intolerance of absolutist and monarchical regimes. The integration of women into Freemasonry created a significant conflict with the intolerance of certain lodges, particularly those of Anglo-Saxon tradition. As I have argued elsewhere, and I quote myself, conflict that remains today and sees within some Masonic traditions will remain indefinitely. What we might call a arrosé, pardon my French, is the bigoted tolerant or a fraternity without sorority. The campaign of women's rights knocked the doors of Masonic temples during the late 19th century. Maria de Resen, a campaigner for secularism and women's rights, was initiated in the French lodge Libre-Penseur in 1882. Later, in 1892, she took a step further, assisted by Georges Martin, by founding a Masonic body that would accept men and women, known as the Ordre Maçonnique Mixte International Les Trois Humains. Fraternal orders have often aligned themselves with nationalistic movements, influencing and being influenced by national identities. For example, the Freemasons played a notable role in different revolutions, promoting ideas of liberty and fraternity. However, nationalist ideologies within these orders can also lead to exclusion and conflict. The alignment with national movements has sometimes resulted in fraternal orders becoming entangled in political controversy and power struggles. The intersection of gender and nationalism with fraternal order creates complex dynamics. Nationalist ideologists often emphasize traditional gender roles regarding the corner of the world in some we have since changed. However, all of them have been conflicted with efforts towards gender inclusion. The intersection can be seen in cases where nationalist fraternal orders resist the inclusion of women or transgender or other LGBTQ people, such as the case of some lodges in the United States and Latin America, viewing it as a threat to their traditional values. Conversely, some orders or versions of some other bodies have embraced gender inclusion as part of a broader nationalist agenda of modernity and progress. So that's the case of the Grand Orient de France, that they are arguably the first Masonic body to welcome a transgender individual back in 2010, Olivia Charmont, after a year of discussion from 2009 to 2010, but that was the first transgender person. That was the Grand Orient de France. And in 2018, the United Grand Lodge of England followed and accepting women who join, individuals who join in their previous, before the transition, and even if they are now women. Normative understanding of masculinity and male behavior vary across cultural, historical, and geographical contexts. Because male behavior and masculinity impact social and political relations, men and masculinity affect the development of nationalism. George Musas argued that modern masculine stereotypes exist in a mutual relationship to modern nationalism. Nationalism, the structure and expansion of the state, are closely related, and institutions like the military, as well as state projects such as imperialism and colonialism, are often dominated by male participation. Even in popular culture, male stereotypes of, if I ask you to think about Mexico, many of you will think about the Mexican macho, the charro, and the strong masculinity. And in fact, the building of the Mexican nation is based on this heterosexual, masculine, toxic man. And that has permeated different fraternal orders, including Freemasonry. Shireen Rai has pointed out how economic development tied to nation-building projects in post-colonial context is often gendered and masculine, ultimately devaluing the economic stability of women and subaltern men, which it can be clearly seen in the United States with the case of some state Grand Lodges, such as the Grand Lodge of West Virginia, who kicked out their Grand Master where they found out that he was married to another man, even though same-sex marriage is legal in the United States. Another case is the recognition of Prince Hall Freemasonry that our colleague in France, Cécile Ravogé, studies closely, and in some states of the United States, they are not welcome. Thus, I argue that fraternal orders are inspired and they follow closely the nation's nationalistic model. Symbolically and ideologically, nationalist movements frequently valorize masculinity, projections of honor, patriotism, bravery, physical virility, rationality, individualism, and duty. Another element that fraternal orders follow that is inspired by nationalistic models is the fact that the specific social and political roles expected of women are not only tied to conceptions of femininity, but are linked to local and national power relations. Social responsibilities such as childbearing or particular forms of employment and interpersonal engagement become feminized and expected of women. Women's labor and women's bodies have provided material and symbolic resources to nationalist and colonial projects. National identities are often linked to women and their reproductive capacity, and in some cases, fraternal orders believe that women don't have the time for civic engagement or need men to practice the ritual, as is the case of the Easter Star that needs men to practice the ritual. Nationalist movements are often aligned with heteronormative family models, that is, heterosexual family units assuming male leadership, female reproduction, as well as natural and complementary roles between men and women. Thus, nationalism has been identified as a tool to support heteronormative structures of power. Thus, fraternal orders have followed such models that exclude or subjugate sexual minorities and those outside of the female-male binary. These kind of movements also trend to emphasize heterosexual ideas as an antagonism of countries where LGBTQ rights have been legalized in a dynamic that some have. Theorist Jasbir Puar suggests that gender discourses of nationalism often demonize or advocate the expulsion of Muslim people in the United States, thus trying particular understanding of the nation state and nationalism to specific configurations of gender. Religion may also inform gender roles in particular locations. Thus, when nationalist projects are undertaken, women and men may feel tension between the gender expectations of the religion and their gender expectations associated with nationalistic discourse. My research is not on gender and religious behaviors and religious practices, but I just wanted to mention this as a way to understand that the scholarship for a scholarship on gender and fraternal orders. As a conclusion, today fraternal orders continue to grapple with gender and national controversies. Some organizations have made significant strides towards inclusivity, while others remain resistant to change. The evolving landscape of social and political norms challenges fraternal orders to reconsider their roles and identities. Debates over gender inclusion and nationalistic ideologies continue to shape the future of these organizations, prompting discussion about their relevance and adaptability in modern society. I am not talking about inclusivity, about this new buzzword and we need to be inclusive, and I'm talking about values and rights of citizenship, of people who pay taxes and people who should have 100% the same rights as others. Fraternal orders with their ritual histories and complex structures serve as a microcosm for broader societal issues of gender and nationalism. Addressing these controversies is crucial for the evolution and sustainability of this organization. As fraternal orders navigate the challenges of inclusivity and national identity, they have the potential to become more reflective of the diverse societies they inhabit. I urge Grand Lodges, lodges, individual Freemasons, and other citizens to make sure the ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité are followed and applied by all the lodges in the world. They should not be tied to the nationalistic practices of their home countries. For example, in my home country, I will have a new woman president, Dr. Claudia Schoenbach, but we have 10 women killed every day in Mexico. That's not necessarily gender progress. So that's not what I want. I don't want tokeism in fraternal orders. I want real change, and I advocating for that. The future of fraternal orders depends on their ability to reconcile tradition with progress and development, embracing change while preserving their core values. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to share the delight of Masonic dialogue. Brothers, sisters, do you have any questions? So you can take a few questions. I think we have some time, but if you want to finish in time to catch the end of the program in the other room, then we should we should be brief. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation. I do have a very brief question when we speak of morals and gender. Beyond the question of the inclusion of women, there are other genders, the transgender people, there's queer people, etc. So, are brothers and sisters able to welcome these genders? And should we not establish a principle like laïcité, secularism, that is to say, to have an agnostic fraternity, if you will?
Très intéressante dans son genre.
In terms of gender. So I suggest that we take a round of questions so that we can give them to our speaker and he can answer them in one go, if that's okay.
A great presentation. Last September, Akram Elias, the former Grandmaster of the Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., mentioned that 16 Northwest American Grand Lodges were meeting to discuss admitting women in Freemasonry. Have you heard of any further development on that discussion?
You want to answer now, or you prefer to gather the question? Each by each?
Either each by each or two.
Okay, you're welcome.
The
You
first,
go.
because they are quick answers. I really appreciate your question. It is indeed, I think the principle of laïcité, secularism, which is part of my work, I mean, also, I was criticizing Mexico for being not very inclusive, but Mexico is one of the countries that really practice secularism. If not, Mexico and France are tied to tie with those practices. So, I mean, in terms of the state. But I think Freemasonry should welcome individuals who practice the core values of Freemasonry, regardless of the gender. And transgender individuals and cisgender and transgender individuals should be welcome to Freemasonry. That's basically regardless of because we need to think about sexuality and gender are two different things. Gender is the expression, and sexuality, sexual orientation, we don't care in Freemasonry what you do, because that's what you do. Gender expression is that what is cisgender people and transgender people should be welcome. That's but we are, I mean, really, I was so excited a few years ago when I met Olivia and also so impressed by this Grand Rodin de France that they were the first one in giving a step forward. But we're not there yet. If this was not the first, please correct me, but that was in my research. And in the United States, I know Elias and he opened the door for me to interview some people, but the issue of women and Freemasonry and the issue of other genders and Freemasonry in the United States of America, the free world, the largest democracy, quote unquote, is far behind France and even England. That the United Grand Lodge of England was very resistant, but in 2018 they started the discussion. But another question.
On passe à l'inter-
Brilliant. Any other questions before we move on to the next presentation? Yes, thank you so much, Guillermo. I really appreciated your presentation. I would like to just contribute two accounts and then perhaps also share two theoretical reflections as well, because I think it's very important the way that you opened your presentation, which is more about historical sociology and historical anthropology rather than ideographic history in the strictest sense, if you will. Now, I have two comments. The first is that a few years ago, 5 years ago, the Grand Master of the Texan Lodge accepted the expulsion of members on grounds of their homosexuality. Now, this triggered a controversy, particularly in San Francisco. So that's one thing that I wanted to contribute. And then the second thing, and you can pass comments on this, the second thing is related to free thinking in the Latin world at the beginning of the 20th century. Masons of a French or Latin tradition, and this actually goes back to the 18th century, they recognized or they invented the right of conjugal recognition. And this is something that was taken to countries of the South America. And this is something that was very much practiced by the Spanish, the Italian, and even the French. However, in 2011, when some activists that were fighting for the rights of minorities wished to reintroduce in Argentine Freemasonry this principle, the directors of the Grand Lodge, refused because they did not want to displease a conservative public opinion. So what do you think about all of this? Obviously, there's a political aspect to all of that. But since so what's your point of view as it relates to the anthropological structure of the family? I see that there's a limitation here. If we believe that people of the North, or Europeans, are more liberal when it comes to social matters, how can we explain the British conservatism as it relates to the feminist question, on the contrary to France?
Yes, thank you, Devrick. And actually, I was somehow involved in the situation in the San Francisco. You know, it was during the when we. I mean, my mentor Paul Rich was extremely upset with the exclusion of brothers who were homosexuals in Freemasonry, and he talked to the Grand Lodge of California because they were hosting the World Conference of Grand Masters or something like that in San Francisco. And it's ironic that in San Francisco, one of the cities with the most rights on the Grand Lodge of California, you have Texas, Alabama, West Virginia, thank you for. I'm really aware of those of how conservative is this situation in the U.S. and how. And part of the reason that inspired me to work on this, that I have worked before on, is because, as you mentioned, and I will tie it to your second point, that yesterday your presentation inspired me about some of the cultural aspects in Latin America, that many of the advances that took place for example, in Argentina, Spain, one of the countries with the first countries in the world with same-sex marriage, for example, and equal marriage equality, and that were very step forward, like other countries like Brazil. There was what I call, some people would call it the Trump effect, but I think it was before Trump. I think it was the Dick Cheney, George Bush effect, the Fox News effect in the world that created a backlash. Every time in gender scholarship, in gender and sexuality scholarship, we see that there is some step forward and then two back. But that is why, for example, we are in June, that is Pride Month. And it should not be understood that the commercial of like, the big, H&M has the flags. It is more, there are still problems, as you mentioned, like in the United States, in England, that they are not women accepted as Freemasons. They are co-masons. So it is important to in my larger, this is like the introduction of this new project, which is based on my previous research. For example, in my previous research, I talked about the feminist aspect, the anti-feminism of the Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry, and how can we learn about Latin Freemasons in Mexico. For example, in the United States, many of the lodges that conduct their worship in Spanish welcome women because they are not from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. They are more from the Latin tradition. So it is indeed, and I agree with you that we cannot think that the global North is going to bring this progress, because perhaps it's progress but not development. So we need to look at it in different latitudes and case by case. But my goal was to invite scholars to think about how gender and fraternal orders need to keep their values their core values, thinking about the individual, not the gender. Thank you.
Désir là de demander à Christophe, si tu veux bien.
Christophe, we're going to ask Christophe, if you don't mind, to come to the stage. Would you like to take the stage?
A changé le changement. Remarquez, c'est
We're going to listen to your presentation if you agree. Thank you for your help. So I'd like to face you, if you don't mind. If that's okay, I'd like to sit. Okay, you can sit closer. Prefer to be at the same level as you. If the session's chair agrees, the chair agrees. Dear Christophe, the title of your presentation is Freedom of Conscience and the Conflict that Nurtures Fraternity. You have the floor. Oh, well, you'll understand why I want to speak here. If you were there yesterday, you have been able to listen to beautiful, remarkable, knowledgeable, documented presentations. I listened to very interesting presentations, and it's a great honor to be in front of you. I was going to be the last speaker before the official conclusion of the talks, but I'm not. I'm the one, the last before, the one before the last one. So I was going to say that I'm going to have to double my efforts to keep you on your toes. But first of all, why don't I want to be? Why do I want to be at the same level? Well, it's because I'm no specialist or expert. And the commission given to me by the organizers of this conference is to place freedom of conscience and its categories on the sidelines of everyday Masonic practice. In a way, to conclude with a few considerations on the way in which freedom of conscience positively fuels, nurtures, which is my title, the title of my presentation, nurtures lodge work over the long term. And more than that, how does it make us Freemasons in line with the values they profess and the oath they have taken? If I've been asked to talk about this, maybe it's because at a more global level, I am in charge of Masonic activities that are in line with this as the chief editor of the journal Humanism. I coordinate this work and I receive texts from different people. And here we created a study and research lodge, which is a bit of a special format in the Grand Orient de France. It's a lodge that doesn't have an administrative weight on the obedience, but the lodge's main and only topic is to work on the universal republic, and freedom of conscience is one of the main tools to do so. And if you want to, you can refer to all the works that have been written. It has all been published. I'm going to talk about this furthermore. It is understood, and we all agree in this, that speaking, conversation, and dialogue bring people together. Each people, with its own culture, develops its own way of sociability in both the public and private spheres. And a quote from Hannah Arendt that you probably all know sums it all up quite simply in political lives, vie politique. And I quote, "For the Greeks, the essence of friendship consisted in discourse. They maintained that only a constant speaking together united citizens in a polis," the Greek word. Dialogue reveals the political importance of friendship and its own humanity. It's hardly surprising then that the Masonic Lodge, as a miniature polis, P-O-L-I-S, city in Greek, is a privileged place for expression, speech, and the construction of discourse. My conviction, and that's when I'm going to delve into the heart of the topic, my conviction is based on a simple premise, perhaps a little hair-raising, a little far-fetched. Freemasonry, and I'm going to add my Freemasonry, because there can be a debate about this, is only worthwhile if you never hesitate to engage in vigorous debate of ideas. Better still, it enjoys tough debate, whereas it suffocates in unctuousness. I'm going to try and paraphrase for you this equation contained in the title of my speech. First proposition: fraternity does not prosper, or at least it does not endure, in soothing harmony. Second proposition, in Freemasonry, conflict is foundational, provided that all the expressions that contribute to the debate are stamped with the seal of authenticity. That's the first condition I'm going to detail later on. Equals proposition 3. This conflict must be soundly led, resolved, and concluded. That's the second condition. These two conditions, authenticity of interventions and the resolution of conflicts, are, in my opinion, only possible if there is freedom of conscience, and thanks to freedom of conscience. Let us resume. I am going to refer to the comments from another chief editor of Humanism, Samuel Tomei, and he worded it in a very intelligent way. In November 2022, he published an analysis in this magazine on the famous egregore that we all know. And he explains ironically that this egregore in the lodge would be a kind of fusion of souls, of communion, the alpha and omega of the Masonic work, the full and complete realization of the tolerance we must have for one another. He says it in an ironic way because he concludes that it is actually, egregore is actually built on controversy. I quote him again, and you'll understand the irony. By a curious phenomenon, the same people who make an idol of tolerance find it hard to accept anyone holding an opinion other than their own, and would like to see Freemasons who are too divisive because they sabotage the egregore. We shudder at the ideas of opposition, discussion, and dispute, and recall that the devil divides when the symbol unites what is scattered. It is a question of dissolving the grains of salt of the reason of some in the sweetness of the emotion of all. So to preserve the unity of the group, we tend to make the egregore, the brotherhood of minds and hearts, a prerequisite. But isn't this taking the wrong path and going about Masonic work the wrong way round? End of quote. I follow him in this direction. Let's see what it would be to do Masonic work the right way round. Leaving your metals at the door of the temple means leaving behind the contingency of your secular life, your preoccupations outside the temple, and therefore your enmities and resentments. But it's much more than that. Insofar as we place ourselves under a rule that is different from that outside, a rule that is written, accepted, consented to, and above all new, with an injunction to seek the betterment of society as well as of ourselves, it is incumbent upon us to also separate ourselves from the conventions of armchair conversation and cognitive biases. I'm talking about armchair conversation, informal conversation. We know that in the profane world, conversation is prescriptive. It often forces us to be hospitable when we welcome others and to show restraint when we are invited, to be superficial if we know little about each other, to avoid confrontation if we are aware of the risks involved, to be ostensibly sensitive if we want to appear empathetic, to conceal ourselves if we want to appear at all, to adopt a form of tolerance from which nothing productive emerges, because we don't reveal ourselves, we don't show ourselves. And this word, to reveal ourselves, is very telling. One Freemason must not reveal himself to another in the secular world. But by contraposition, the Masonic moment, the practice in the temple, cannot be understood without unveiling oneself. Our rituals make it an absolute prerequisite, even at initiation, to leave the metals at the door of the temple, because this is a key function in initiating dialogue. It's not just about putting aside resentments, it means cracking open the whole armor and revealing everything. It means going to the depth to overcome superficiality, choosing frontal demonstration to avoid evasion, opting for the truth of your feelings if you don't want to sink into affectation, opting for the truth of your ideas if you expect the same from the other, being attentive rather than tolerant. Choose radicalism to guarantee the authenticity of your convictions. And if there is disagreement, if there is controversy, if there are disputes, don't silence them. Express them in all their dimensions, in all their facets. Make them flourish. It is at this price, by bringing together the conditions for a Masonic dialogue, which is no more and no less than a philosophical dialogue in the Socratic sense of the term. It's at this price that we do useful work, the better, to build society afterwards. Socrates, in the philosophical debate, invoked 3 rules. Clearly define the subject of the discussion and listen to the other, and have the other person listen to you. Instruct and allow yourself to be instructed in a benevolent and honest manner. And finally, conclude the discussion. This pendular reciprocity of honest speech of the person who speaks and benevolent listening from the person who listens is decisive. In Gorgias, Plato makes Socrates speak, and he says, and I quote, "I hesitate to refute you. I'm afraid you'll get it in your head that if I'm speaking, it's not to clarify the subject, but to pick a quarrel with yourself. So if you are my kind of man, I will be happy to question you. If not, I will leave it at that. What sort of man am I? I am one of those people who enjoy being refuted if they say something untrue, and who also enjoy refuting others if they say something inaccurate, but who do not enjoy being refuted any less than they enjoy refuting. For I believe that it is more advantageous to be delivered from the greatest of evils than to deliver others from it. For in my opinion, there is nothing so fatal for man as to have a false opinion on the subject we are dealing with today. So if you say you feel the same way as I do, let's talk. If, on the other hand, you think we should leave it at that, let's stay there and finish the discussion." The philosopher Alain, 2,500 years later, and maybe he had read Plato, and I quote, he says, "It is in this transparent world of these thesis and antithesis, contradictions and refutations, that the mind knows itself. Anyone who refutes enters into the mind of the person he's refuting and agrees with him. Isn't that marvelous? Man, therefore, has the power to understand even when he's not understood." Alain, like Plato and others, understood that a happy sociability was achieved not by the insignificant and gentle neutrality of each person's contributions, but by the ability to absorb and go beyond debates and discussions of a contentious nature. Socrates, too, insisted on the need to bring the debate to a formal close, not to make a dead letter of it, and to arrive at a resolution that took account of all the parties. Disputes and opposition are only fruitful if they remain purged by compromise. There are different ways of purging a debate. Through compromise, so we have reached an agreement; conciliation, we have signed peace; or democracy, a vote is held to arbitrate. And if you think about it, whether we come from one side of the Atlantic or another, we all have the same Masonic practice. The Masonic method is entirely based on the handling of conflict by several procedures from which the Freemason cannot exempt himself. First of all, there are the procedures for speaking, which prevent direct altercation by providing for a central and neutral intermediary, the worshipful master. There is obviously the democratic fact, which provides for a rule of arbitration, voting. It's binding us all. And finally, there is the sword of Damocles, constituted by the internal disciplinary system of the obediences. Here we are. if Freemasonry flourishes in the egregore, if the egregore is established in a healthy conflict, there can be no healthy conflict without freedom of conscience. So why such a debate can only be guaranteed by freedom of conscience? To define freedom of conscience is in itself very complicated. It's like climbing a mountain. But we can try and understand what is the freedom of conscience for a Freemason. I'm talking about the Freemasons from the Grand Orient de France because to us it's a mantra, more particularly since 1877, and we have mentioned it a lot all along the day. It's only thanks to freedom of conscience that Freemasons can first of all deliberately free themselves from the gang formed by all the social and cultural determinisms of their births in order to express themselves sincerely. Free in conscience, they can access their innermost truth, polish their thoughts, and above all translate them without fear. Without fear is important, before an audience. Free in conscience, they are ready to fight intellectually if necessary. They can argue serenely and dryly as well in front of a silent, attentive audience, detached from the prejudices and presuppositions because they listen in a benevolent way. Free in conscience, they focuses the Freemasons their argument on the idea they are defending or the one they are fighting. One person defends their point of view, everyone defends theirs. And the ritual is there to signify in a homothetic way this, and it's a quote from Kant, who would have been 300 years old last month. It's important to celebrate this. Freemasonry opens up a world of possibility. And the quote from Kant, is the emergence of man from the state of guardianship. So Freemasonry opens up a world of possibilities for freedom of conscience to anyone who wants to go far. It allows everyone, regardless of social rank, origin, or beliefs, to shed the rags of the old man, the archaic man, as quickly as they wish, and to be reborn a virgin more available, freer, and wiser, more persuasive and more combative. It is on this addition of mutations that the group then thrives. As an apprentice, you are invited to leave behind the secular envelope weighed down by sclerosis and social and educational stereotypes, and to enter into the depths of yourself to find out more about yourself. As a companion, you land on populated shores, populated by others like yourself, of the same value, the same richness. This is a moment to enter into free solicitude for others, and we are masters, worthy to sit amongst our peers and accountable for the smooth running of the group, and above all with an ambitious roadmap for improving society. Because we are talking about truly working together, there can be no question of mediocrity. It must be a discussion that reflects the seriousness of the subject, the hope and the challenges and the ideals of the action ahead. And I have invented a mathematical sequence, or arithmetical sequence if you want, which seems to me organize the work at the lodge. It leads from the initiation through disputatio, controversy, to the egregore. Initiation creates security. The obligation of the oath, the cohesion of a group, common rules, the secrecy of membership and debates. Doubt creates balance, suspension of judgment, discernment, free examination. Listening to each other creates equality, method and rituals, intellectual, social, and cultural singularity, multiple points of view. Radicality creates accuracy, sincerity, simplicity. Friction, disputes create truth. Emulsion of ideas, patina of thoughts, attenuation of bias, learning to deal with contradiction. And finally, the resolution creates sociability. In other words, the egregore. This feeling of being the fulfilled part of a whole in which all the parts are equally fulfilled. A vibration in which Freemasons struggle to distinguish between the emotional, the spiritual, the symbolic, the intellectual, and even the carnal. But let's face it, all too often we are afraid. We're afraid of a debate. We like the egregore that is leading us to emotions in which we feel comfortable. And we spare each other so as not to mar the facade of harmony. To maintain, and I quote Samuel Tomei once again, a completely artificial civil peace, a silly sacred union that is the antithesis of reasoned social harmony. All that's left for Masons to do is to ease their conscience by regular philanthropic practices, the main thing being to avoid getting angry about anything. By doing this, we abdicate any chance of truly, resolutely achieving the promise of Freemasonry, what we constantly promise ourselves, that is to say, to be without any reservations the center of union. We maintain a small state of equilibrium which does not produce great things, but preserves the juxtaposition of tranquility. It's not a problem to work at your own pace or to work more slowly than others, than your brother or your sister sitting next to you. What is serious is betraying the goals of this great idea by not going to the end of the tussle from which you come back full of dialectic, proud of having held your position or proud of having been able to change it, rich with a firework display of words and ideas. Happy too that the collective has found the philosophical solution in the struggle. But let's end on a democratic note when we speak about freedom of conscience. Obviously, freedom of conscience, or at least its expression, can only thrive in regimes that allow it. Because where dictatorship reigns, there is no freedom of conscience. Where democracy mutates, Trump's United States, Bolsonaro's Brazil, Putin's Russia, to name but a few, freedom of conscience withers. This is a lesson for the days ahead for us as French people, I said. Thank you for this extremely interesting presentation. They went to the source of the classics and highlighted their clarity, their energy. And as a provisional chairman, ephemeral chairman, I'd like to thank you on behalf of us all. I have the pleasure of saying you may ask some questions, but briefly, if you may so. I listened to your presentation with great pleasure, this love for dispute and controversy. And when I listened to it, I thought, ooh, that's far from our own reality. And then you distanced yourself a little bit from this beautiful, enchanted asylum and got closer to reality. But what we can blame Masons for is maybe to too often confuse tolerance with a lack of conviction. Very interesting. If you allow me, I'm going to ask you if you want to take a few questions before answering. As you wish. I prefer we group questions together, just for timekeeping. And so that some of our friends can go and join the Temple Grossier. So some questions. If you want to ask another question. I'll try and be brief. I will be brief. You talked about freedom of conscience. I don't know if I've understood it well, but some will find that freedom of conscience is the freedom to have ideas, an inner freedom that no one will be able to change. No one can change someone's inner self. But then we talked about something else in this type of freedom at start. Maybe not just convictions, but the search of the truth. I heard the word authenticity. Did I understand well that in this freedom of conscience, the whole of the Masonic approach is part of this? Looking for the truth, listening others. So is this what the Masonic approach is all about? Thank you for your presentation. Just to be brief, I think that it's a very French definition, French-oriented definition. I attended English lodges in South America. It's completely different, but my question is the following one. To protect this French culture-oriented Masonic approach, how can we prevent this to be infiltrated by secret agents, or which was the case in Brazil, where Brazilian Freemasonry is dominated by Bolsonarism, the same way in Argentina, and from my experience. So how can we protect French Masonic culture from those intrusions? And already from the 18th century, it started taking place with the triple observance, for instance. I'd like to comment on what our brother said. You used the premise that authenticity was a way of entering a discussion. I'm wondering what this means, to be authentic. I feel that the Freemason is looking for this all his life. What is his own authenticity? Who is he truly? We never know when we are acting on emotions, that's due to past life history, family history, etc. Short intervention. The main driver for Masonic dispute is reason. Where is it? Where is this reason? Good evening. Since it's very topical, and earlier on I heard that we were talking about the police forces, I'm from Bordeaux. I frequent several lodges, and I've noticed that in Bordeaux there are several brothers and sisters who are part of the surveillance services and the police forces, and I'm wondering what can we do with this? Well, I'm not really a learned man. I just wanted to share my convictions, so I'll try and answer. But the reason, yes, of course, that's a tool to organize a discussion. Here I'm talking about freedom of conscience, to answer what you're saying, as a tool for Freemasonry. And to me, the whole of the Masonic practice must be under the seal of the freedom of conscience. And if we don't do this, this is not the correct Masonic practice, and we won't succeed in what we want to do. I'm not trying to teach any lesson here. I know that I'm also very influenced by this, and we always try to reset, to reboot ourselves, to work on ourselves, so that we don't play with emotions, or emotions don't enter in a dialogue with someone else. That's the Masonic work. We don't succeed, but because we don't succeed, we have to face anger, disputes that might not be solved, that might not be purged, and we're not going to change the world. If today we had to leave the temple to save the Republic, if we had to um, mobilize ourselves to go into this struggle, we wouldn't be able to do this. And my Masonic engagement is born because we need to improve the society. So improve myself, or that my friend improves himself, is not really important. What's important is to better the society. That's our common work. And we would do this, by the way, if a demonstration walks by the street, and that's the case today. If there were riots, we'd know what to do collectively to protect ourselves. So that's what we must do for any type of topics, whether it's banal or serious, simple or complicated. That's how I see things. I don't know if I've answered everything. Just regarding the political question, yes, freedom of conscience is a first world luxury that is experienced by democracies, and when you're not in a democratic process, you have to do it in a more violent way. So I've put aside all of the political comments because I don't know how to answer the comments on the participation of intelligence services. But I wanted to use this concept of freedom of conscience as the cornerstone of our Masonic activity. Thank you very much for those clear answers, as clear as your presentation. Maybe you can help me move this heavy chair.
Lorcaille, si tu veux bien.
Lorcaille, if you want to go and take the floor. Thank you, Christophe, once again. Laura is going to introduce herself because, as we say, she needs no introduction.
Le micro.
I hope the microphone is working. It is. Go ahead. Thank you very much. Charles was asking me how I should be introduced because it says Lorcaille. But if you don't write anything, people will throw titles on you. It might be that you aren't worth anything, or you're so well known that you don't need to be introduced. Anyway, you'll see who I am, I hope, throughout this presentation, which is entitled How Laïcité Came to Women. So in her last book, Cécile Révauger, the organizer of this symposium, in her introduction to her book on women's Freemasonry, asked the following question: is there a link between the rejection of women and the question of absolute freedom of conscience? In other words, is the concept of regularity advocated by the GLUA and the obediences recognized in the world based exclusively on the exclusion of women, atheists, or both? So, when we, in fact, in the autumn of a long feminist commitment, I've often had to question the relationship, not without paradox, between the secularization of societies and women's rights. In addition, as a Freemason and a member of two female obediences and a women's jurisdiction, I'm very pleased to be here to be able to give this presentation. But as a member of two female obediences in a women's jurisdiction, I've had to work on the history of female Freemasonry, an area in which academic research has only taken an interest relatively recently. So how did laïcité come to women? So I'm going to try to take a cross-sectional look at Freemasonry's relationship with freedom of conscience and laïcité in general, and at the possible specificity of women's laïc commitment, particularly that of women Masons. For this purpose, I have limited myself to France as an example of laïcité understood both as a country's organizational and legislative foundation and as bearer of values and a social project, and as the only country where the presence of women has been attested since the 18th century. Speculative Freemasonry acknowledges the model from which it draws its inspiration, that of intellectual circles frequented by its founders, first and foremost Jean Théophile Desaguliers, the mastermind behind the Opération Grand Lodge of London. The Royal Society is a it's the Royal Society for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, in fact, is a think tank before its time. It's a lab of ideas for study, experimental research, and scientific and metaphysical speculation. Yet, it was not just a new learned society that the founders instituted, but an unprecedented space, that of an initiatory fraternity. In this way, Masonry would become the center of union and the means of forging true friendship between people who would otherwise have remained perpetually estranged. In countries ravaged by religious wars and dynastic struggles, this was a gamble on reconciliation and harmony, a utopia of universal concord rooted in the clash of opposites. A bold gamble. But wasn't it already in the zeitgeist? Some 10 years after the publication of the constitutions, Montesquieu's Considerations sur les causes de la grandeur des Romains et de leur décadence, considerations of the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline, was published. A union of harmony, so that all the parts, however opposed they may appear to us, contribute to a general good of society, just as dissonances in music contribute to total harmony. From the constitutions to the present day, to be a Freemason, you have to be of good character, and above all, free. This freedom is still required of neophytes before they can be initiated. But what kind of freedom are we talking about? In the lodges of dogmatic obediences, it is often assumed that absolute freedom of conscience is a fundamental tenet of Freemasonry. However, this assertion is more a credo than an observation, in any case, an abusive generalization. The reality of the Masonic landscape bears witness to the fact that a dogmatic Masonry is not the majority. Regular Freemasonry in the 21st century is as theistic as proto-Masonry in the earlier 18th century. At that time, the fledgling institution, baptized, so to speak, by two men of the church, had not freed itself from religious belief. Atheism still smelled of sulfur. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to apply the moral law, and if he understands art well, he will never be an atheist nor an irreligious libertine, and absolute freedom of conscience seems still a long way from being the order of the day. And yet, in the Masonic proposal that for convenience sake we'll call Andersonian, we can detect an evolution, even a revolution. It follows in the wake of the latitudinarians who, rejected the magisters of the intercessors and the interpretations they oppose, appeal to the critical spirit of each individual. Seeing reason, rather than the spirit, as the primary interpreter of scriptures, the latitudinarians profess the right and even the duty not to rely solely on the authority of the church but to question the texts themselves. The right of examination, Prüfung, that's the German word, had already been asserted by Luther and Calvin, but it was the latitudinarians who formulated the concept of free examination that Condorcet, in his first Mémoire sur l'instruction publique in 1791, advocated it as a philosophical attitude and pedagogical principle. Contrary to arguments of authority and dogma, free examination contains the seeds of absolute freedom of conscience, which would find its ultimate Masonic form a century later. I'm now going to provide a quotation which is in the principle of a universal freedom in Belgium, and this means free not in the French sense, which is religious, but rather laïque. So a laïque value by excellence. Free examination implies not only the affirmation of a right that of absolute freedom of conscience, but above all, the affirmation of a duty, that of recognizing no dogma and proceeding with a critical spirit to question received ideas. An unprecedented call to unite good and loyal men or men of honor and probity, whatever denominations or beliefs that may distinguish them. The reference to this religion of which all men agree, which the editors oppose to the religion of the country, is understood as an attempt to define religion in its etymological sense of universal reliance. This asserted ecumenism represents a liberation from dogma, an emancipatory, even transgressive act which, with the proposal to opt the grand architecte de l'univers, a concept open to various degrees of belief and interpretation, is, at the time, truly visionary and predates the radical break of 1877. The new brotherhood being established in England as a structured organization is in tune with the society in which it is taking root. It was obvious that women could not meet the requirements laid down by the constitutions, even if they were of good moral character. It was thus indisputable that they were not legally free, so it's only natural that they should be left at the door of the lodges. In France, however, it's a completely different story. When it crossed the Channel, Freemasonry underwent a transformation, an original crossroads between the Masonic proposal from England, marked by the club model and its masculinity, and a space inspired by the French salon, a precursor in terms of mixed sociability, where women played their full part in the debates of the century, and the emergence of the new Enlightenment discourse on the notions of universality, reason, and equal rights. Masonry in 18th century France was a veritable emancipatory space, which women didn't hesitate to enter. However, given that membership of Masonic lodges is limited to upper-class women who, like most of their male counterparts, are loyal to the throne and the altar, we might well wonder whether they are able to adhere to the distancing of religion in their Masonic practice. The rituals of adopted lodges are just as inseparable from the biblical narrative as the rituals of men's lodges, all the more so as these rituals, specifically written for ladies' masonry, were written by men who chose the themes that seemed most appropriate to them, so Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, Jacob's Ladder, the Garden of Eden, and that they therefore convey a stereotypical vision of the eternal feminine. But many Freemasons were sincere activists for gender equality, such as Condorcet, Chauderlos, Delaclos, and Helvetius. And Freemasonry was a special place of sociability, since, to paraphrase Anderson, men and women masoned together who would otherwise have remained perpetual strangers. Unlike Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry, French Freemasonry did not suffer from the blind spot of gender exclusion. The synergy created by a mixed and, for the time, resolutely egalitarian group provided an incomparable space for exchange and intellectual deepening. And it was indeed the values of the Enlightenment, the discourse on reason, the exercise of critical judgment, and that is to say discernment, and the ability to, I quote, step outside of one's minority, to use Kant's expression. The French Revolution brought about a decisive reversal, challenging the Church's monopoly on these highly symbolic moments in life, such as birth, marriage, and death, with the introduction of the civil state, marriage, and civil funerals. At the same time, however, it effectively excluded women from political citizenry for what was to be a particularly long period. We all know the iconic figure of Olympe de Gouges and her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, a famous formula that was soon disproved. So she never went to the podium. And this is just an aside, since she was interned to the Panthéon, this was something that was raised by feminist movements. I met Olympe de Gouges in the four-column room at the National Assembly. And the fact that this is possible is due to the Grand Lodge, Women's Lodge of France and their opinions. And this led to her being honoured at the National Assembly. So the 18th century would signal the end of recreation for women and for Freemason women in particular. The empire is an absolute counterexample when it comes to laïcité and women's rights, with the Concordat on one hand, and on the other hand, the imposition of the Napoleonic Code, drafted by Cambacérès, a notorious Freemason, making women eternal civil minors. Adopted lodges flourished again after the revolution, but reduced to docile auxiliaries in the service of the Napoleonic project. They lost their rebellious, emancipatory character. In England, the unification or the reconciliation of the lodges of the ancients and those of the moderns resulted in the ritual and institutional supremacy of the ancient and led to the creation of the GLUA, establishing a lasting theism and confirming the exclusion of women. A few years later, this is much less well known, in 1849, the Grand Orient, hitherto to the Conservatory of Andersonian Masonry, experienced a dogmatic backlash when it adopted a constitution which until then had not existed, and which specified in Article 1 that Freemasonry has at its principle the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. The Murat ritual of 1858, named after the Grand Master of the time, introduces invocation of the GADAU as the transcendent creative principle at the opening and closing of work. We heard Philippe Roussier yesterday, who talked about the fairly unknown 27 years of the Grand Orient of France. It was also at a time, coincidentally, when women's and mixed-sex lodges were disappearing, gradually replaced by thoughtful family festivals, and when women's struggles for emancipation were taking place outside temples. Libertarian activists, notably the Saint-Simoniennes, including Eugénie Niboyer, Pauline Roland, Florent Tristan, coined the phrase, "The most oppressed man can oppress a being who is his wife. She is the proletarian of the proletarian herself." Major figures in the social debate of the 1840s who gave their names to current women's or mixed-gender lodges, but who are not themselves Freemasons. After the Revolution of 1848, women vainly demanded the right to vote, even though universal suffrage had just been established in France and that the secularization of society was advancing at a pace. To be a convinced secularist, one must be no less violently macho at times. I can't resist quoting the misogynistic tirades of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, one of the first to claim the freedom to have neither God nor master, in his book From Justice in the Revolution and in the Church, from 1858. I quote, a woman is nonetheless inferior to a man, a sort of middle ground between him and the rest of the animal kingdom. The difference between the sexes is of the same nature as the difference between the races of animals. So, far from applauding what is called the emancipation of women in today's world, I would be inclined, if it came to that, to place women in confinement. So, throughout the 19th century, while the male tenors fought for freedom of conscience and equality for the male half of mankind, women, excluded from the forum as well as the temples, became heavily involved in the activist niches that were left to them. And first and foremost, there was the education of girls, a decisive issue for emancipation that the enlightened Masons of the 16th century had already formulated, in particular Condorcet, who said that we really had to focus on female learning to give access to women and to knowledge. Having recognized that the gap in access to education between girls and boys played an important role in the inequality of rights, public school teachers stubbornly defended, not all of them of course, defended on a daily basis young girls' access to a public laïc education that was not necessarily self evident. But they did this, they did so on the forum, not in the lodges to which they no longer had access, even though the will of their comrades in struggle, it was the will of their comrades in struggle themselves. Thus, while the vow number 9, for which Pastor Frédéric Demans was reporter at the 1817 GODF convent, abolishing the obligation to believe in God and the immortality of the soul and introducing absolute freedom of conscience. And I'd like to quote a brother at the GODF: "It was easier to get God out than to get women in." It wasn't until journalist Maria Derem, an ardent feminist activist, forced open the doors of Freemasonry with the help of the Libre Penseurs du Pec Lodge and the Grand Lodge Symbolique Écossaise, who initiated her on the 14th of 1882, and it was then that women were allowed into the lodge. Their move led to the immediate suspension of the lodge, then its reinstatement after the rebellious brothers had quickly fallen into line. And it was only 11 years later that Maria Derem, together with George Martin, founded the mixed obedience, Le Droit Humain. Who was the one who was in New Caledonia? Louise Michel, sorry, that's yeah. Thank you. So Louise Michel was initiated into the Grand Scottish, the Grand Lodge, the Scottish Symbolic Grand Lodge. So alongside George Martin, she founded the mixed obedience, Le Droit Humain, and I'd like to quote her: "Freemasonry, the enemy of superstition and error, is the natural adversary of the Church. However, by strange contradiction, Freemasonry, as it relates to women, follows the wanderings of Catholicism, which largely sterilizes its efforts and actions. How could Freemasonry, antagonist to the clergy and hated by it, fail to understand that introducing women into its order was the surest way to reduce and defeat it? It had at its disposal the instrument of victory. It left it inert in its hands," and this is in a speech, but I don't know the source of the speech. Now, let's talk about the law of separation, that is to say, what free examination in its most developed form, that is to say, freedom of conscience, and how we arrive at the separation, that is to say, laïcité, or secularism, laïcité. So, it was often the males' voices that were heard. We know that one of the arguments of those who were hostile to the female vote on the 9th of December 1905 will be remembered as this date will be remembered as a symbolic date on which France became a secular state with the act of separation. But in reality, we had to wait until 46 for the word secular to be, or laïque rather, to be enshrined as such in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. Of the Fourth Republic, rather, then in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. In the Fifth Republic, France is an indivisible, laïque, secular, democratic, and social republic. The law established the principle of freedom of conscience for all and, consequently, of equality before the law for all human beings, regardless of their beliefs or lack thereof. Despite its undeniable exemplarity in terms of institutional secularism, French society continued until very recently to have an ambiguous relationship with a moral order with clearly religious overtones. There is no shortage of examples to illustrate this when it comes to women. So we remember the law of divorce, which according to some was opening the door to immorality, the hysteria in the chambers during the family planning adventure, which involved Pierre, Simon, and Yvan Dornez from Grand Lodges. And then as for the law on the voluntary interruption of pregnancy or abortion, we remember the climate of attacks that Simone Weil had to endure. Now, the 20th century was to see a new wave of committed women entering Masonic lodges, putting into practice their feminist and Republican convictions, which were now explicitly combined with a demand for laïcité and even for some, an assertive anti-clericalism. This was mixed within the Droit Humain Federation and in adoption lodges, this time under the aegis of the Grande Loge de France. This new adoption lodge, while adopting a ritual inherited from those of the 18th century, operates completely independently of the men's lodge on which they are theoretically based. In fact, the UJLE gave total freedom to women to be able to organize. I have 3 minutes remaining, I think. So I'm going to go through the women's lodges, liberation, and the Masonic movement in France, because there's a lot of information, and I recommend the book, which is entitled Faithful Pioneers of the Marianne. Thank you. And it's in the Voix d'Initié collection, and it discusses in a very precise and documented way all of the commitments and engagements of these women, and commitments that we would like to see replicated this in today's world. In France, the 1970s saw the emergence of new forms of commitment that clearly demonstrated many women's desire for specifically feminine spaces for reflection, speech, and action outside of traditional ideological frameworks, and it seems to many of them that Freemasonry can offer such a space. The emergence of at the Grande Loge Féminine de France, lodges work exclusively in the ancient and accepted Scottish rite, and unlike the Grand Orient de France, the GADLU is not optional. Admittedly, the architect is no longer necessarily God, as he was, and still is called regular. It's the so-called regular obediences, but he remains, whether we like it or not, a transcendent principle, which the ritual liturgy at all degrees confirms. That's why some sisters thought it was time to take these developments into account and open the doors of women's Freemasonry to women who wished, as the founders of Unite affirmed in their profession of the faith, to practice a rite stripped of all deist connotations, and who, refusing to oppose the initiatory approach to the humanist project, wanted to associate in their work the symbolic path. Now, I'll spare you some of this. I will go to the collusion. So it was in 2003 that there was the introduction of the reference of laïcité in the declarations of principle. So Freemasonry seeks to ensure mutual tolerance and the respect of the other. They affirm their attachment to the principles of liberty, tolerance, laïcité, and the respect of rights of others. But more recently, the Grand Orient added 20 years ago one sentence to Article 1 of the Constitution, and in that article it mentions laïcité. So, how did laïcité come to women, and more specifically to Freemasonry? Well, perhaps we should flip the question and ask more generally how women, generally, and Freemasons came to laïcité. I hope that I have been able to shed some light on this and to demonstrate that the discourse as it relates to gender equality in the 18th century observed a society where laicite is not sufficient as it relates to women because it ignores data that does not come under these principles. But advancing the right of women means that we recognize laicite as a strength, as a lever, and as a way to create conditions to respect the rights of all. Laicite is the best guardian of freedom, where communitarism is just the identity of segregation and rejection. The ideal of laicite seeks to build an identity, a coming together, which is necessary for our fight, and one that I hope that you're all ready to embody. Thank you very much.
T'avoir un peu brusqué.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks. I apologize for rushing you. We see how difficult it was for Freemasonry to open up to half of mankind. Humankind, rather. I apologize. I should like to benefit from having the microphone to perhaps, for the fourth time, to thank our interpreters. We've already applauded them a number of times, but we'd like to thank them for doing this job with such brio. So thank you very much. Now, perhaps we could have a round of questions. Again, this is not to upset you, but rather to ensure that we can move on and see the remaining part of the symposium. So, should we take a few questions? Hello. Thank you very much for that presentation. I had a question about current times. In fact, today, in today's world, laicite is. I apologize. This question was asked this morning. I'm working on it. That's why. But laicite leaves the door open to the possibility of practice of faith. So this vision of laicite, which opens the door, leaves the door open, does it not lead the way to alienation?
What? Et après tu répondras.
Oui, merci.
Thank you for this presentation, a very interesting presentation. A question on the current society as well, because we see that girls do better at school until the A levels, the end of secondary school, and then when they enter the labor market, they are always facing obstacles, the glass ceiling, etc. How can we find a solution to this? I'll start with this question. It's what I was saying. It proves that laïcité is a necessary condition, but far from being enough for equality. And it's a fact. Girls' school results are better, and then afterwards, through career choices, Yvette Rodi, for instance, was a Freemason and Minister of the Women's Rights. She had tried to favor girls' access to sectors that were male-dominated. The success was quite mild, and today it's still a problem. The more you study, and of course it evolves, there are progress, but very slow progress. I'm not sure I understood. I mean, I understood what you said about. You asked, is laïcité instrumentalized so that it becomes coercive? Do you think that because of laïcity we should allow everything, and for instance, off mic? Well, those are the limits of laïcité. In the Constitution, the texts say we don't talk about freedom of religion. First of all, we talk about freedom of conscience. We always talk about freedom of religion, but no, first of all, there's freedom of conscience. And within this freedom of conscience, it includes the freedom to believe or not to believe. The 1789 Constitution said that no one should be blind for one's opinion, even religious people. So there's a type of hierarchy in this. You can manifest your religion if it doesn't have an impact on the public order. And that's why laïcité has never said that you could do whatever you wanted to manifest your religion, and that faith could have a role to play in law. That's where the red line. You can have faith, but you can't adapt the law to this. And then if you want my personal opinion on the veil, on the women wearing a veil, I think it's neither a scarf or another symbol or nor a European campaign that is the subject here, but it's what is imposed by the Islamist autocracy, idiocracy. Thank you. Off mic. We're going to conclude this session, and you can continue next door if you want to listen to the rest of the conference.